Dear listeners, I welcome you to my channel. If you like my work, please subscribe to the channel, like this video and write a comment. This helps the video to promote and motivates you to try harder every day. If you want to support the channel financially, the link is in the description and in the profile header. Thank you. Enjoy listening. The day I moved into my new apartment, the sky was a dull shade of gray, thick with the promise of rain. The moving truck had long since disappeared down the street, leaving me alone with a sea of boxes and a creeping sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the apartment itself. It was modest, a little outdated, but nothing out of the ordinary. It wasn't the neighborhood either, quiet, residential, with neatly trimmed lawns and houses that all seemed identical. It was something else, something I could feel just beneath the surface, a subtle but persistent sensation of being watched. I shook it off as nerves. Moving to a new city was stressful, after all. I was here for a fresh start, a new job, a new life. The last thing I needed was to let paranoia set in before I'd even unpack my kitchenware. I spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through my belongings, trying to make the place feel like home. It was early evening when I met him. I was hauling the last of my boxes inside when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned just in time to see my neighbor standing on the sidewalk in front of his house, watching me. He was tall and gaunt, his skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, his eyes deep-set and dark. He wore a long-sleeved button-up shirt, despite the summer heat, and slacks that looked slightly too big for his wiry frame. There was something unsettling about his presence, but I forced a polite smile as he stepped forward. "You must be new," he said, his voice soft, almost too soft. "Yeah, just moved in today." I wiped my hands on my jeans and extended one in greeting. "I'm James." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking my hand. His grip was cold, his fingers thin and bony. "Pleasure to meet you, James," he said. "I'm Mr. Holloway. Welcome to the neighborhood." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks. It's a nice area," I said, glancing around at the rows of houses, all eerily similar in their design. "Quiet." His lips curled slightly, as if at some private joke. "Yes," he agreed. "Very quiet." An awkward silence stretched between us. I wasn't sure what to say, and something about his unwavering gaze made my skin crawl. Finally, I cleared my throat. "Well, I should get back to unpacking. But, nice to meet you, Mr. Holloway." He didn't move, didn't blink. "Likewise," he murmured, before turning on his heel and walking back toward his house. As I watched him disappear inside, a shiver ran down my spine. There was something about him that made me deeply uncomfortable, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Maybe it was his stillness, the way he spoke barely above a whisper, or the unsettling way his gaze lingered a second too long. Whatever it was, I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't here to make friends with the neighbors. I had a new job starting in a few days, and my priority was settling in. That night, as I lay in bed, the feeling of unease still lingered. The street outside was silent, almost unnaturally so. No cars, no distant hum of city life, just an oppressive, suffocating quiet. Somewhere in the house next door, I thought I heard something move. A soft, dragging sound. Then, silence. I told myself it was my imagination, that it was just the sounds of an old house settling. But as I drifted into uneasy sleep, one thought lingered in my mind. Mr. Holloway's hands were cold. Too cold. The days passed uneventfully, but the feeling of unease never quite left me. I told myself it was just the stress of moving, the unfamiliar creaks of a new home, the adjustment to a different routine. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something about Mr. Holloway kept gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, even when I wasn't looking at his house or seeing his shadowy figure pass by his curtained windows. It started with the smell. I first noticed it one morning when I stepped outside to grab the mail. It was faint but distinct, a thick, cloying scent that hung in the air like rotting meat left in the sun too long. I wrinkled my nose, glancing around for the source. Maybe a dead animal nearby? A trash bin left open for too long? But the smell wasn't coming from the street or the garbage cans. It was coming from Mr. Holloway's house. His windows were shut tight. His yard was immaculate, with no sign of any food waste or rotting debris. And yet, the stench seeped from his home as if the walls themselves were exhaling it. I glanced toward his door, half expecting it to swing open, but nothing moved. The house remained silent, lifeless. I tried to ignore it, but the odor lingered in my mind even after I had gone back inside. That night, it was worse. A breeze carried it through my slightly cracked bedroom window, making my stomach churn. I shut the window tight, but the thought of that scent clung to me like an unwanted memory. Then came the sounds. At first, I convinced myself they were just the usual noises of an old house. Wood settling, pipes groaning, the occasional skittering of a rodent in the walls. But as the nights passed, I realized these sounds were different. They weren't random or intermittent. They were rhythmic. A low, dragging noise. A soft, muffled thud. Sometimes, it sounded like something heavy being scraped across the floor. Other times, it was faint, almost like whispers filtering through the walls, though I couldn't make out words. One night, unable to sleep, I crept to my window and peeked through the blinds at Mr. Holloway's house. His lights were on in the kitchen, casting long shadows against the walls. For the first time, I saw him in his home, moving about with slow, deliberate motions. He was standing over the counter, his back to the window, his hands working on something I couldn't see. And then he stopped. His shoulders stiffened, and he turned his head ever so slightly, as if listening. As if he could feel my eyes on him. I ducked back behind the blinds, heart pounding, cursing myself for being so obvious. I waited, breathless, but when I dared another glance, he was gone. The kitchen was empty, the lights still burning. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I saw the bags. I was leaving for work when I noticed Mr. Holloway stepping out of his house, holding a large black trash bag in each hand. He moved with eerie precision, his grip on the bags tight, his posture unnaturally stiff. The bags bulged in odd places, their shape inconsistent with ordinary garbage. He didn't take them to the curb where the usual trash pickup was scheduled. Instead, he walked past his driveway, down the side of his house, and disappeared behind it, out of sight. I stood frozen, pretending to fumble with my car keys as I watched. Minutes later, he returned empty-handed. My stomach twisted. What was in those bags? Why not throw them out like normal trash? The smell, the sounds, the bags, it was all adding up to something I didn't want to think about. I considered calling someone. The police, maybe? But what would I say? That my neighbor smelled bad and took out weird-looking trash? That I heard noises at night? It wasn't exactly evidence of a crime. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. That night, I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows before going to bed. I told myself I was being paranoid. But when I turned out the lights, I swore I heard footsteps just outside my window. And a quiet, rasping breath. The strange occurrences with Mr. Holloway continued to fester in my mind, growing like a sickness I couldn't shake. The smell, the noises, the way he disposed of his garbage, it all painted a disturbing picture I didn't want to believe. But reality had a way of forcing itself upon me, and soon, something happened that I couldn't ignore. Someone went missing. It started as an innocent conversation with Mrs. Callahan, the elderly woman who lived 3 houses down. I ran into her one afternoon while retrieving my mail. She was a sweet, frail woman who always wore a floral cardigan no matter the weather, and she had a habit of sharing neighborhood gossip. "Have you seen that young man?" she asked, clutching her shopping bag a little tighter. "The one who does deliveries." "I haven't seen him in days." I frowned. "Which young man?" "Oh, you know, the one from the grocery store. He always brought my orders on Tuesdays. Tall, blonde, such a polite boy. But he never came this week." Her wrinkled brow furrowed. "And I called the store. They said he stopped showing up for work." just vanished. A cold chill ran down my spine. Do they think something happened to him? I asked carefully. No one knows. She shook her head. People go missing all the time these days, but it's just odd, isn't it? It was more than odd. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat and forced a casual smile. I'm sure he'll turn up. Maybe he just quit and didn't tell anyone. Mrs. Callahan nodded, but her expression remained troubled. Maybe. But it's strange. He always told me he needed the money. He wouldn't just up and leave. The conversation haunted me for the rest of the day. I tried to push it aside, convincing myself that a missing delivery boy had nothing to do with my unsettling neighbor. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the eerie silence of the neighborhood. The usual distant hum of cars and late-night wanderers was absent. The only sound was the occasional creak of my house and the whisper of the wind against the window. And then, around midnight, I heard it again. A dragging noise. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from the direction of Mr. Holloway's house. My pulse quickened. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and crept toward the window. Peeling back the blinds just enough to see, I held my breath. Mr. Holloway was outside. He stood near his driveway, his tall frame illuminated by the dim glow of a street lamp. He was dragging another black garbage bag toward the backyard, his movements methodical, unhurried. The bag was large. Heavy. The way it slumped and shifted made my stomach churn. I wanted to look away, to convince myself it was just trash. But then, as he paused to adjust his grip, something happened that made my blood run cold. The bag moved. Not from his handling of it, but from within. A weak, shuddering motion, as if something inside was still alive. My breath hitched in my throat. I bit down on my lips so hard I tasted blood. Mr. Holloway froze. For a terrifying moment, I thought he had noticed me watching. He stood there, perfectly still, his head slightly tilted as if listening. Then, slowly, he continued dragging the bag out of sight, disappearing behind his house. I stumbled away from the window, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe. No. I knew what I saw. And I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to do something. But what? The police? What would I tell them? That I saw my neighbor carrying a garbage bag that might have moved? That I had a bad feeling about him? It wasn't enough. I needed proof. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and opened the camera app. Next time, I would record everything. Next time, I would have evidence. Because I was sure of one thing now. Mr. Holloway was hiding something. And I was going to find out what. I barely made it through the next day. Every sound, every shadow, every passing moment felt heavier, like the air itself carried the weight of my unease. I went through the motions, breakfast, work, small talk with coworkers, but my mind remained fixated on what I had seen the night before. The bag had moved. Something inside had been alive. Or at least, it had been before Mr. Holloway dragged it away. That night, I decided to get proof. I spent hours debating my next move. Calling the police without concrete evidence was pointless. They would dismiss my claims as paranoia, maybe even reprimand me for wasting their time. No, I needed more. I needed to see exactly what Mr. Holloway was hiding. So I waited until nightfall. At precisely midnight, I dressed in black and turned off all the lights in my house. I didn't want even a flicker of movement to alert him. Peering through my blinds, I watched his house, waiting. The familiar creeping dread slithered up my spine as I stared at his windows, searching for movement. And then, I saw it. A light flickered on in the back of his house, dim and yellow, barely visible through the heavy curtains. A shadow passed by, his shadow. He was awake. And he was in that back room. I grabbed my phone and slipped outside. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to my skin as I moved across my yard, careful to avoid making noise. The neighborhood was silent, as always, an unsettling emptiness that made every step I took feel unbearably loud. I reached the side of Mr. Holloway's house and pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear. There it was again, that sound. The same dragging noise I had heard before. And something else. A soft, muffled whimper. My stomach lurched. I moved toward the backyard, every muscle in my body tense. I knew it was reckless. I knew I should turn back. But I had come too far to stop now. Peeking around the corner, I spotted the source of the light, a basement window, slightly ajar. Carefully, I crouched down, my heart hammering as I positioned my phone's camera at the perfect angle. What I saw through that window made my blood run cold. Mr. Holloway was inside, standing over a long wooden table. Strapped to it was a man, young, barely conscious, his wrists and ankles bound with thick leather straps. His face was bruised, his clothes torn. His chest rose and fell in weak, shallow breaths. And in Mr. Holloway's hand was a knife. I slapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp, my body shaking violently. My phone trembled in my grip as I hit record. My breath came in shallow bursts as I watched, unable to tear my eyes away. Mr. Holloway leaned in close to his captive, whispering something I couldn't hear. Then, with a slow, almost reverent movement, he pressed the knife against the man's arm and dragged it downward. The man let out a muffled scream, his body convulsing against the restraints. I jerked back from the window, bile rising in my throat. My entire body was screaming at me to run, to get away from this nightmare. But I forced myself to stay just long enough to capture a few more seconds of footage before retreating into the shadows. I needed to get to the police. Now. But as I turned to leave, my foot brushed against a loose stone, sending it skittering across the ground with a sharp clatter. I froze. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the basement light went out. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted, my pulse thundering in my ears. I sprinted back toward my house, fumbling for my keys as panic clawed at my throat. Just as I reached my front door, I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I shoved the key into the lock and twisted it just as a shadow loomed over me. I barely managed to slam the door shut before a sharp knock echoed through the wood. My breath hitched. I stepped back, gripping my phone like a lifeline. Another knock. Then, a voice. Calm. Even. James, Mr. Holloway murmured from the other side of the door. It's awfully late for you to be out, don't you think? I didn't answer. I couldn't. A slow chuckle. I know you're awake, James. Open the door. Let's talk. My fingers hovered over my phone screen, trembling as I debated calling the police right then and there. Another knock. This one louder. More insistent. James. I saw you. The world spun. My vision blurred. I pressed my back against the wall, heart racing so fast it hurt. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, footsteps retreating. I waited, breathless, until I was sure he was gone. Then, with shaking hands, I opened my phone and stared at the video I had recorded. I had proof. But now, he knew I had it. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat in my darkened living room, my phone clutched in my hand, replaying the footage over and over. The dim glow of the screen cast eerie shadows on the walls as I watched Mr. Holloway's cold, calculated movements. The helpless victim strapped to the table. The glint of the blade as it pressed into flesh. The muffled cries. Proof. I had proof. But now, he knew I had it. Every creak of my house, every whisper of wind against the windows sent a fresh jolt of fear through me. I felt trapped in my own home, as if the walls were closing in, as if Holloway's presence lurked just beyond them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I needed to get out. I needed to go to the police. But as I reached for my keys, a chilling realization sank in. He had seen me. He knew where I lived. What if he was watching now? What if he was already inside? The thought sent me into a frenzy, checking every lock, every window, every possible point of entry. My paranoia had reached its peak, but paranoia wasn't unwarranted when a monster lived next door. I hesitated before making the call. What if the police didn't believe me? What if he somehow got to them first? The thought made me sick, but I forced myself to push forward. I dialed 911, my fingers trembling against the phone's glass. The line rang once, twice, then silence. No dial tone, no operator's voice, just nothing. I pulled the phone from my ear and stared at the screen. No signal. Panic clawed at my throat. I rushed to my router, checking the connection, but my Wi-Fi was still active. My internet worked, but my phone service was completely dead. He cut it. I felt a cold sweat break out over my skin. My neighbor had cut my phone line. He knew. He was cutting me off. I needed to leave. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, but as my hand touched the knob, a shadow passed across the peephole. A slow, deliberate knock followed. James, I know you're in there. Mr. Holloway's voice was calm. Too calm. Like he was savoring the moment. I backed away from the door, heart hammering in my chest. He knocked again, louder this time. You shouldn't have seen that, he said, almost like a parent scolding a child. You really shouldn't have. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen in place. Come on now, James, he coaxed, his tone dripping with false patience. Open the door. Let's talk. I glanced at the back door. Could I make a break for it? But what if he had someone watching? What if he was waiting for me to run? The knock came again, sharp, deliberate. Then, the sound of metal scraping against the lock. He was trying to get in. I bolted. I sprinted toward the kitchen, aiming for the back door, but as I reached for the handle, a sound from behind made me stop cold. Glass shattering. I whipped around just in time to see his arm reaching through my now broken living room window, his fingers clawing for the lock. He was coming in. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I burst through the back door and into the night, my feet pounding against the ground as I sprinted toward my car. My fingers fumbled with the keys as I reached the driver's side door. Behind me, I heard the front door crash open. James. I barely got the door unlocked before he was on me. A strong hand grabbed the back of my shirt, yanking me backward. I twisted, swinging wildly, managing to hit him in the face with my elbow. He grunted, loosening his grip just enough for me to tear free. I dove into the car, slammed the door shut, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, headlights flashing on just in time to illuminate Holloway's face, his expression twisted into something inhuman, something hungry. I slammed my foot on the gas. Tires screeched against pavement as I peeled out of my driveway, my pulse thundering in my ears. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I needed to get to the police. I needed to survive. Because now, I wasn't just a witness. I was prey. The road ahead blurred as I sped through the empty streets, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, my heart hammering so violently I thought it might give out before I reached safety. My mind reeled, unable to process what had just happened. Mr. Holloway had tried to kill me. No, he had tried to capture me. And I had barely escaped. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see his headlights chasing after me, his monstrous silhouette emerging from the shadows. But the road behind me was empty. No sign of him. No sign of anything at all. I needed to get to the police. The nearest station was only a few miles away. If I could just get there, if I could show them the video on my phone, they'd have no choice but to believe me. I had the proof. I had the evidence. But as I reached for my phone, my blood turned to ice. The screen was cracked. No, no, no. I fumbled with it, desperate to open my camera roll, my fingers shaking so hard I could barely navigate the screen. The video was there. The thumbnail alone was enough to make my stomach churn, Mr. Holloway standing over his bound victim, blade in hand. I tapped the file. A black screen. Then, corrupted file. Unable to play. A strangled cry tore from my throat. I tried again. And again. Every attempt ended the same way. The video was gone. My only proof had been destroyed. Had he done something to my phone? Acted? Or had it broken when I fought him off? It didn't matter. I had nothing now. I nearly slammed on the brakes. If I went to the police now, what would I even say? That my neighbor was a murderer? That I had seen him torturing someone in his basement but had no evidence? They'd think I was crazy. Worse, they'd investigate him, give him time to cover his tracks. And then he'd come for me. I needed a new plan. I couldn't go home. That was the first place he'd look. But where could I go? My parents lived 2 states away. I had friends, but I couldn't drag them into this. There was only one option left. A motel. I took the next exit, pulling onto a desolate road lined with flickering streetlights. The neon glow of an old roadside motel came into view, a rundown, barely functioning establishment with a single vacancy sign buzzing weakly in the dark. It would have to do. I parked at the far end of the lot, away from the main entrance. My legs felt weak as I stepped out of the car, paranoia creeping up my spine. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. Every gust of wind carried a whisper of danger. Inside, the motel clerk barely looked up from his magazine as I handed him cash. No questions. No ID required. Just a key and a room number. Exactly what I needed. I locked the door behind me the second I stepped inside. The room smelled of mildew and stale cigarettes, but I didn't care. I closed the curtains, barricaded the door with the rickety wooden chair, and collapsed onto the bed, my body trembling. What now? I couldn't stay here forever. I needed a new plan, a way to expose Holloway before he found me. The police wouldn't believe me without proof, and now that my video was gone, I had nothing. Unless I went back. The thought made my entire body recoil. I had barely escaped with my life. But the only way to stop Holloway was to catch him in the act again, this time with backup. I would need to go back to his house. I didn't sleep. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, each one worse than the last. But by the time the first rays of sunlight peeked through the grimy motel blinds, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to run. I was going to end this. By nightfall, I was back in my car, parked a few blocks away from Holloway's house. My hands were clamming against the steering wheel as I watched his darkened windows, waiting for any sign of movement. I had no plan, no backup, just a desperate hope that I could somehow outsmart a man who had already proven himself to be a predator. Then, just past midnight, the basement light flickered on. My stomach lurched. He was home. And he was back in his basement. I took a deep breath, forcing my fear down. This was my chance. If I could catch him again, if I could stream the video live so there was no way for him to erase it, I could finally bring him down. I slipped out of my car and moved toward the house, staying low, using the neighbor's fence as cover. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn back, to run, but I couldn't. I wouldn't. I reached the same basement window I had spied through before, my breath hitching as I crouched down. I pulled out my phone, opened the camera, hit record. Slowly, I peered through the glass. The table was empty. No victim. No restraints. No tools of torture. The entire basement was spotless, as if nothing had ever happened. My heart pounded in confusion. Had he moved his operation? Had he somehow known I was coming? Then, a sound from behind me. A footstep. Before I could turn, something cold and sharp pressed against my throat. "James," Mr. Holloway whispered, his voice sending ice through my veins. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" The last thing I saw before everything went black was the wicked smile on his face. Darkness swallowed me whole. The first thing I became aware of was the cold. It seeped into my bones, an unnatural chill that made my skin prickle. My head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic pain, and a metallic taste lingered in my mouth. The air smelled damp, like rust, mold, and something far worse. I tried to move, but my wrists wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I realized they were bound, tight, unforgiving. My ankles, too. Something rough scraped against my skin with every shift of my body. Rope. I wasn't just tied up. I was trapped. My breath came fast and shallow as I forced my eyes open, blinking against the dim, flickering light. Shadows danced along the walls, their twisted shapes making my pulse hammer. It took me a moment to realize where I was. The basement. Mr. Holloway's basement. A whimper clawed at my throat, but I swallowed it down. Fear wouldn't save me now. I needed to think. I needed to get out of here. I scanned the room, my vision still hazy. The table where I had seen his last victim was empty now, but the metal restraints were still bolted to its surface, a grim reminder of what had happened here before. A workbench sat against the far wall, its surface littered with knives, saws, and tools that gleamed under the weak light. The air was thick with the scent of blood, old and new. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. My heart slammed against my ribs as I turned toward the sound. A figure emerged from the shadows, his face calm, composed, like this was just another ordinary evening for him. Mr. Holloway. He tilted his head, watching me with something that almost resembled curiosity. "You just don't know when to stop, do you, James?" I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my words sticking to my tongue. I forced myself to swallow, to steady my breathing. "People will notice I'm gone." He chuckled, a soft, amused sound. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, I've been watching you for a long time. You live alone. No close family nearby. A few coworkers, maybe, but none that would raise an alarm if you missed a day or two." I clenched my fists, testing the ropes again. They didn't budge. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Holloway sighed, as if disappointed. "You already know the answer to that, James. You saw what I do. What I need. And now, well, now you're part of it." A chill ran down my spine. "You think you can just make me disappear? No one will ever find out?" His smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "That's the thing about people, James. They only see what they want to see. And when they start asking the wrong questions." He lifted a knife from the workbench, turning it over in his hands. "Well, I make sure they stop." Adrenaline surged through me. I pulled harder against the ropes, my skin burning as the fibers bit into my wrists. Holloway watched, amused. "Struggle all you want," he said, taking a step closer. "But soon enough, you'll accept it. Just like the others did." Others. The word sent a fresh wave of horror through me. How many had there been before me? How long had he been doing this? "You're a monster," I spat, rage rising through my fear. Holloway sighed again, almost disappointed. "Monster? No, James. I'm simply evolved." He took another step closer, twirling the knife between his fingers. "You see, survival is about adaptation, about finding new ways to thrive. Some hunt, some gather, and some consume." I clenched my teeth. "People are going to find out. I'll make sure of it." "Oh." He raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" I had no answer. Not yet. But I wasn't going to let him win. Holloway leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You should feel honored, James. Not everyone gets to be a part of something greater. Something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to die here. Not like this. With every ounce of strength I had left, I yanked my arms up, ignoring the searing pain as the rope tore at my skin. The chair beneath me wobbled, its old, wooden legs straining under the force of my movements. Holloway's smile faltered, just slightly. And that was all I needed. I threw my weight to the side, the chair toppling with a deafening crash. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I barely felt it. My hands were still bound, but I had managed to loosen the knots just enough. I writhed against the ropes, fighting against the agony as I pulled one wrist free. Enough! Holloway snarled, lunging toward me. I didn't hesitate. With my newly freed hand, I grabbed the nearest object, a rusted metal pipe that had been lying near my feet, and swung it with everything I had. The impact was sickening. Holloway staggered back, blood blooming from a gash on his forehead. His expression twisted from shock to fury. You little... I didn't give him the chance to recover. I scrambled to my feet, ripping the remaining rope from my ankles as I bolted toward the stairs. My legs were weak, my head still spinning, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind me, Holloway roared in anger. I reached the top of the stairs just as he grabbed my ankle. I kicked back wildly, my foot connecting with his face. He let go just long enough for me to yank open the door and stumble into the hallway. Run. I sprinted through the house, my only thought to escape. My hands fumbled with the front door lock, but just as I wrenched it open, a heavy force slammed into my back, sending me crashing to the floor. Holloway's hands closed around my throat. You should have just stayed quiet, he hissed, his grip tightening. Spots danced in my vision. My lungs screamed for air. My fingers scrambled against the floor, searching. And then I felt it. My keys. With the last bit of strength I had left, I gripped them in my fist and drove them into his neck. Holloway let out a strangled cry, his hands releasing me as he staggered back. Blood poured from the wound as he clutched at his throat, his eyes wide with disbelief. I gasped for air, forcing myself to my feet. I didn't stay to watch him fall. I ran. I burst through the front door, sprinting into the night. I didn't stop. Not when I reached my car. Not when I sped down the road, my breath coming in ragged sobs. I had escaped. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over.